All right, first things first, the microphone's working? All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here. My name's David Boardman. I am an orthopedic surgeon, a member of what may very well be the least mindful profession on the planet. And I'm here to talk to you about a subject that made absolutely no sense to me whatsoever about 4 or 5 years ago, and does now, to the point where I have this overwhelming need and urge to talk about it, because if you have a human brain, this message is for you. And in particular, the ladies who did the Laphaceuticals, I believe, asked you to stand up if you are sick and tired of hearing, "Let it go." So, for those of you who stood up for that, I need you to stand up again and come down to the front row, because this message is for you. All right, I'm going to be mindful of this light, so every time I guess I'm going to have to do that differently. Okay, so here's my talk. My talk has a lot to do about meditation. The current buzzword for such is mindfulness. Raise your hand if you have heard this word recently. Okay, good. Raise your hand if you have a clear knowledge of what they're talking about. Good. The subtitle is, "My Brain, Am I Using It, or Is It Using Me?" I've given this talk to this is probably, I would say, the 30th time I've given a talk like this, and it does keep evolving and reiterating itself. And I have had an opportunity to speak to nurses, teachers, doctors, school employees who aren't teachers, and I'm broadening my scope to anybody with a human brain. And at my newlywed wife's request, I have actually taken some steps with the help of a good friend to actually be videotaped today, which will help hopefully broaden the message. This is a message I'm here to speak to you. It made a ton of sense to me, and I'm hoping that it will make sense to you. So, like any good speaker, let me try this again. I'm going to start with the finish. Here are the take-home points about meditation. Are you ready? Meditation is only possible for humans. Meditation is not natural for humans. Meditation is very difficult for humans, and the real reason I'm here is to tell you that meditation is very, very good for humans. There is nothing intuitive about what I'm going to tell you. This subject needs to be taught. There is nothing, most people's lives have led them to this naturally, certainly not mine. So a couple disclaimers. This is not formal mindfulness training. There is such a thing. It's called The Rest of Your Life. This is just an hour of kind of explaining some concepts of why. I am certainly not a mindfulness scholar. Better? It's just a message that I seem to understand and know how to speak about. So I'm here teaching a subject. This is not my subject that I invented. This is just something that means a lot to me, and I'm hoping will mean a lot to you. The content of what I present is not original, although the format has been something I've come up with that seems to strike a chord with audiences, and I'm happily and gratefully honored with repeat invitations to come and speak on the subject. This subject may be artificially interesting. What do I mean by that? Well, this is an important concept I'm going to drive home toward the end. You are all in what I would argue is a novel experience right now. You are doing something that is out of your common daily routine. You are doing something I heard already was have a meeting that only happens once a year 30 or 40% of you have never been to this meeting before. You are doing something that you have not done before and don't routinely do, and therefore you are processing what I'm about to say with a part of your brain that you don't normally use during your regular day. And a lot of what I'm going to say to you may make sense, may even be inspiring, may even be compelling to go out and do something different. And my prediction is that as soon as you get back into your routine life, you're going to have a hard time feeling that inspiration and compulsion again. Because when you're doing your routine daily life activities, you're in a different part of your brain. Those two parts of your brain do not speak to each other very well. They're right next to each other. They don't speak to each other very well. And then the last subject is, if this seems harder than it should be, it is. This is hard. So a little bit about me. I was more managed as a child than raised and parented. I grew up in a household with two very, very strong-willed parents who had a lot of structure and best of intent for me, their middle child. And I didn't know any better, but I lived in an environment of purely conditional love. So the only ways in which I ever learned how to feel good about myself or get any sort of positive reinforcement or validation or emotional boost was to learn what the expectations were made for me by my parents primarily, and eventually my teachers, and eventually myself, and then not only meet them, but exceed them. That's how I felt good. There was not a lot of cuddling and hugging and just kind of snuggling on the couch and watching movies for no good reason in my household. And I don't want it to sound like this was in any way abusive, because it wasn't. This was my parents doing the best they could with what they had and with the best intentions for me. My father is an aeronautical engineer, okay? He understands the concepts of being careful. He understands the concept of being precise. He understands the concept of being accurate, and they're all very important. And he taught me little rules like, look before you leap, haste makes waste, measure twice, cut once. And this is, this got him to a very, I'm going to just stop leaping over that thing. It's got him to a very successful place in his own career, because in the engineering world, this is what you did. My mother has what is undiagnosed, other than by me, as 75 years of untreated childhood PTSD. So my mother was born into a Jewish household in Holland in 1935. And somewhere around age 5 or 6, she and her 7-year-old sister were accepted by a quote-unquote benevolent family in a remote Holland, northern Holland farmland to help them survive the Holocaust. Their mother went into hiding, more like the Anne Frank story, in a home. Their father never escaped Auschwitz. And although she and her sister and her mother survived a childhood that she didn't know how to compare to anything else, because that's all she had some emotional scarring that to this day doesn't want to talk about, doesn't really believe exists. She has become what people describe of Holocaust survivors has been some of the most powerful survival skills you could possibly imagine. There's nothing you can't do if you put your mind to it. That's what she was. She was try again. There is no excuse for failing, just keep trying. And there is actually a fair amount of literature out there on what's called a second-generation Holocaust survivor, or people who were raised by people who survived the Holocaust. I read the preface to one book, and I was reading my autobiography. So I had a mother who very, very, very strong-willed, there's nothing you can't do. I had a father who taught me the importance of being very careful. And then, because I was a Jewish boy growing up in the San Fernando Valley suburbs of Los Angeles, the expectation was I was going to either be a doctor or a lawyer. I was a baseball fan growing up in LA, and people asked me what I wanted to do for a living. I said I want to be a Dodger, and my mom would constantly correct me and tell me I'm pronouncing it wrong and I meant to say doctor. So this is, in a prior talk, this used to be the space shuttle, but I've moved on, because apparently the space shuttle doesn't exist anymore. So this is a private rocket ship made by a company called SpaceX in Southern California. And the entire purpose of this to here is rocket fuel, and its entire purpose is designed to send this part to the space station. Okay? So this was me. This was the rocket fuel of my parents' upbringing. And the only way of learning how to feel good about myself was to exceed people's expectations. That was the rocket fuel that was engineered into me. This is how I started my life on my way to becoming a doctor. And this is what my life looked like from roughly age 10 to about 32. So here's Dad. Think, analyze, plan. Think, analyze, plan. There's my mom. Try, do again, keep on doing. And here's being a doctor, and here's me. And I can't see what it looks like from up here. I can only see what it looks like from down here. I spent, if you include high school, 19 years on this staircase. And all I needed to do in the moment was leap the next step. This was a project. My life was a project. I was the project manager. I can tell you there's probably no way to become an orthopedic surgeon without having this mentality. I didn't understand any of what I'm telling you right now here. This is what I've come to learn about how I instinctually and through nurturing lived my life. Through creation of projects and completion of projects. Expectations, meeting expectations. Expectations, meeting expectations. A little bit of positive reinforcement, more positive reinforcement, more positive reinforcement. If you do this for long enough, it becomes habitual. The only way I ever figured out how to feel good of myself was to set goals and meet or exceed them. I did this for 45 years. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just calling it out because it's not the healthiest way to live. My life was a series of check boxes. And of course, on the day I got my medical degree, this is what I felt. And I have felt this way every day since then. I wake every morning with an absolute joyous feeling of contentment, glee, happiness, internal positive reinforcement that is sustainable for 50 more years. Not true. Okay, what I didn't know climbing that staircase is what it felt like to be on the top. It felt like a good goal, and it certainly was. I had no idea what it was going to feel like to be on the top. I love stealing images from Google, by the way. So if there are any copyright people here, I'm sorry. I'm sure most of this is illegal. Cut that from the tape. So here's another image that I have doctored up. So this is the career escalator. I added, in addition to college here, I added, for me, medical school, 4 more years, residency, 6 more years, fellowship, another year still. And then I got to the top. I was a physician. 17 years ago next week, I started my first and only job with Kaiser Permanente as a joint replacement surgeon. I'm still in the same job. It's much different up here when the steps are gone. I had no coping skills other than to keep trying. You see what's going on here? I had one tool: try harder, set a goal, and keep working. Measure it, analyze it, make sure I'm doing it right. If I fail, just keep doing it. That was the entirety of my skill set for life management. And I got to a place in my life where there were no more stairs. I had to start setting them for myself. It was kind of an awkward thing for a while. It worked for about 10 years until it stopped. And the only tool I had was to try harder. And all it did was shove this truck deeper and harder and tighter underneath this overpass. Well, this is jumpy. So, I'm not alone, turns out. Physician burnout, nurse burnout, teacher burnout, it's a thing. It's definitely a thing. One of the problems with diagnosing yourself with this is that it seems weak. It seems like the sort of thing my mom would never want me to admit. You're not burnt out, David. You just need to try harder. Well, David, I'm not sure what it is you think's burning you out, but you obviously haven't analyzed it carefully enough. And this is being written on, so I mean, that was part of the validation process for me, going through a little crucible and personal turmoil in which I came to grips with the fact that the skill sets I had for 45 years were not the only ones of use. Perhaps there's other ones that might be of some benefit. And I'm not alone. I know that you're not all teachers, but these are the best images I can find, so work with me here. It's not hard to find images on this. I like this one. Raise your hand if you identify with this. Okay, so the audience is engaged, that's good. Here's somebody's analyzing you, they analyze me, they analyze you too. They're looking at the problem. The problem is that for some reason teachers don't stay in the job. I mean, this is retained, I don't know, this is in Utah somewhere, but I'm sure there's a curve in Oregon very similar to it. As years go on, the number of teachers that are dropping out. Guess what happens when the teachers drop out? There's more work to do for the teachers who are still there. That's called So I'm certain that this is something that applies in your world. It is certainly something that applies in mine. Okay? The United States per capita is the most expensive country for healthcare in the industrialized world. The United States per capita is the 15th highest quality of healthcare in the industrialized world. So in my profession, people are asking, where is the money going? And so I come to work every day being asked to do more with less. The budget's going down. We're cutting medical assistants. The operating room's working on a lean staff. We're not rehiring the position of that orthopedic surgeon colleague of yours that just retired. Oh, but we expect more of you. Here's the stress reduction kit. I found this on a teacher's website, actually. Bang head here. Directions. Please place kit on firm surface. 2, follow directions in circle. 3, repeat step 2 as necessary or until unconscious. 4, if unconscious, cease stress reduction activity. So that to me is kind of like driving a truck harder and harder underneath a bridge. This is another teacher cartoon. When will people realize that a 2-month vacation isn't a perk? It's a therapeutic necessity. So what happens inside when we get this sense of burnout? I'm being asked to do so much more. Is this sustainable? Sometimes it erodes from who we think we should be, the best inherent good person. I mean, it's the case in medical care. It's certainly the case in the educational field. You go into this field to serve. You want to be of service to others, which is very laudable. And you go through a training program thinking this is going to be a great career. It's going to be very fulfilling. And it certainly has the capacity to. But when you get to work, there's all these constraints that make it so hard to be that self that you want to be. And it can spin on itself. This is an old Far Side cartoon, looking at her class saying, miserable little monsters. Not being her best self, really, right? Okay, woo! All right, this is touchy. My definition of burnout. Burnout is a collision course between the persistent failure of the world to meet my expectations, red, bold, expectations, and my deeply ingrained and habitual inability to accept the world as it is. I personally spent 40 years learning how to not accept the world as it is. If I stood still on any one of those steps, I never would have made it to the top. I knew it was hard, but I was bolstered with rocket fuel self-will and analytic capabilities. And when I was halfway up the hill, all I had to do was look back and say, look how successful I've been so far. This is clearly working. This is all I need to do, is just keep trying harder. Eventually, I got to the point in my life when trying harder didn't work anymore. Stopped working. Then what? Kaboom. I worked really hard on those last two slides, by the way. So I'm not going to go into all the details of what actually happened in my little crucible of career-threatening drama. But to suffice it to say, I was directly face-to-face with a reality that I had never actually accepted before, which is that I may not be as much in control as I've always thought I was. And if you're an orthopedic surgeon, that's a very hard thing to come to grips with. I would say that if you have a human brain, that's a very hard thing to come to grips with. Interesting. It's super sensitive 1 second, and now it's not responding at all. All right, so I haven't actually said what mindfulness is yet. Did you notice that part? Did you see those red words on the last slide? Expectations and acceptance. All right, mindfulness. This is just plain old not working anymore. I do, but I could probably just stand here. It'll be... Yeah, it's going to be hard. Would you mind if I just changed my remote control real fast? Yeah, go ahead. Okay. So mindfulness has many, many definitions. All right, I'm going to take you through a couple of them. To me, mindfulness is attention to the present moment, i.e., reality, outside the context of my expectations. Kind of a foreign concept for me. Another one, very simply, is awareness without assessment. This is not intuitive. This is not normal. This is not a sign of intelligence. This is not instinctual. This is something that has to be taught and learned. This is nothing about this is the nature of a human being. John Kabat-Zinn, whose name maybe some of you have heard, who's kind of considered the American father of the mindfulness movement, has been studying the subject for over 30 years at the University of Massachusetts. This is his quote: "Paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, without judgment." That's a bunch of foreign gobbledygook, right? I don't even know what that means. All right, well, I'm going to conduct a mindfulness exercise, okay? Just by a show of hands, who here has ever meditated or tried to meditate? Wow, good. So those of you who are familiar with meditation know that in general, most meditation exercises have what's called an anchor, or something that you're being asked to bring to your attention. Traditional mindfulness meditation is your breath. There's walking meditation, there's movement meditation, there's yoga, there's all sorts of meditative exercises. I invented one. It's called visual meditation. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you about 10 consecutive pictures of a single person as he ages from a boy to his current state. And all I want you to do, here's your anchor, is to visually be aware of what happens to him as he ages. Thoughts will come into your mind. That is not a sign of weakness. I don't want you to focus on them, but you're going to. That also is not a sign of weakness. The meditative exercise here is to be aware of what your brain does on autopilot, even though you don't really want it to. Okay? Okay, who felt some thoughts come in their head? Everybody probably, right? So unless you crawled out from under a rock the other day, you know that this is a celebrity, somebody who you've probably seen or witnessed in some capacity in the course of your life, have some prior experiences that you associate with him, good, bad, or otherwise, memories. And all I really want you to do is look at his face, but your brain is so intellectual and engaged and habitual at using your past experiences to help interpret the moment rather than just let the present moment be the case without your overlay of what you think or you believe, that you, like every other human being, maybe except some Buddhist monks who've been on the side of a mountain for the last 30 years, would have a hard time having thoughts like, oh, I remember that movie that he was in, or, ooh, I wonder what aging change I'm going to see on the next picture, or for you particularly competitive-minded people in the room, I'm guessing there was at least a handful of you who thought you were the first one in the room to know who that was at the earliest age, or some version thereof you were thinking. That's what we do. We have this organ between our ears. It's called a brain. Are you using it, or is it using you? Raise your hand if you have one of these. Okay. Sometimes I get worried before I give a talk because I don't really know who my audience is. It's easy. If you have one of these, I'm talking to you. Raise your hand if you know what you did with the owner's manual. Exactly. So the analogy, I, about a year ago, needed to replace the plastic garage door clicker for my house. It's a little dark gray box with a light gray button, and you push it. Okay? It came with an owner's manual. The first 3 pages of this owner's manual were warnings on how not to use this device. Yet this, which would arguably be the most sophisticated entity on the planet, has no owner's manual. But if it did, I would argue that about the first 5,000 pages would be on how not to use this, because it can screw you up. So here is a paradox of the human brain. A paradox being two things that seemingly are completely opposite of one another, but both true. To me, the human brain is simultaneously the human race's, greatest asset and our greatest liability. Because there are certain things the human brain has allowed us as a species to do to be the champion species of the planet, and there are certain things that the human brain puts us at risk for that no other species has, like depression, anxiety, melancholy, sadness, burnout, plus a whole host of the entire spectrum of mental health disorders. Okay, the reason humans have mental health disorders is because they have a brain that has this incredible intelligence and capacity. They go together. We spend most of our time honing the asset with no awareness of the liability. Now, my first point, only humans can meditate. Only humans need to meditate. There are not bears sitting in a circle on the campfire with their legs crossed, saying Om. They don't need to. And you'd never know it. This is just another organ in our body. So here's a healthy-looking heart, healthy-looking lungs. There's a kidney, pretty benign-looking, just a picture of it. I took human anatomy. These things were all just laying on a table during an exam. I had to guess, tell which one's which. From the outside looking at them, you'd never know. This is the one that I deal with every day. It's the femur. It's the thigh bone. And if you have hip arthritis, I chop this off and give you a new hip replacement. And if you have knee arthritis, I slice this off and give you a new knee replacement. Right now, my femurs are holding me up. No questions asked. My heart is pumping. My lungs are exchanging oxygen for carbon dioxide like a champ. My kidneys are filtering the 3 cups of coffee I had before I got here. This organ is sabotaging me every single minute of every single day. And you'd never know by just looking at it. It's just another organ in the body. But guess what? The human brain is the only organ in the body that has the capacity to cause disease. The human brain has a mind of its own. Every other organ will steadfastly carry out its duty just as asked, where the brain clearly does not have the best intent of the rest of this organism in mind. So a little neuroanatomy, okay? Here's a slice right through the half of a human brain. This is the front, that's the back, here's the spinal cord. And this is just a diagrammatic representation of 3 important areas that are relevant to this talk. The first one is this tiny little area here called the reptilian brain, also known as the instinctual brain or the dinosaur brain. It's the part of the brain that evolved first. And yes, the reason I'm showing it to you is because it is dead center in the middle of this, which is the human brain. We have this exact same brain that dinosaurs had. In a second, I'm going to tell you about this center part here, which is like the relay station between instinct and thought. Here's where all of our thinking goes. This is where our intellect is. This is where our memories are. This is where our application of logic, pattern recognition, all the things that make us seem really smart. The thing that got us to be the chief species of the planet is all right here. This is where our instincts are, and here's the emotional relay station that is constantly, every single day, trying to interpret the difference between what we think and what's actually happening. So, this is a crappy slide, but it's a picture of a lizard being chased across a desert floor by a bird of prey. Okay? Lizard, threat. Okay? Now, No matter how much we see Disney movies where they personify thoughts and human intention into animals, this lizard is not saying, "Oh shit, I'm about to die." Okay? It is not thinking. It doesn't know what a bird is. There is an instinct that's keeping this lizard alive in that one and only part of its brain, that tiny little center part which is all the lizard has. Threat. Danger. And there's a certain type of neurotransmitter that gets fired in very large doses called epinephrine. Fight or flight. Okay? This lizard has one coping skill. Running like hell. And it is not thinking, "I need to run." It is not thinking, "I need to run over to that rock where the bird can't get me." It is not thinking. It's reacting in a pure, fear-based danger instinct. And if it's lucky, it will find that rock where the bird can't get him. And it is not saying to itself, "Whew, that was close." That tiny little midbrain is now being flooded by a different neurotransmitter, or a pair of transmitters, dopamine and serotonin, which are the feel-good neurotransmitters. They're the ones that I got when I exceeded my parents' expectations. Same neurotransmitters. I had no awareness of it. It just feels good. It's the survival instinct that lets this lizard know what I just did was good. This is how animals survive. That's the survival instinct right there, because danger is scary and safety feels good. I'm going to show you another lizard you might be more acquainted with. Okay, so I showed you a picture of what the human brain looks like, and inside of this cute little skull is that whole brain, but most of it's not turned on yet. The only part that's turned on at birth is the same part a lizard has. That's important to know where everything starts from, is that when you're born, you have a danger and safety paradigm in your head. There is no thinking. There is no logic. There is danger and safety. Now, we all know as adults that the baby's not in danger, but the baby doesn't know that. The baby has any of a variety of reasons to cry. It will. And it's not thinking, "I know I'll cry because I need a diaper change," or "I know I'll cry because I want to be put down for a nap," or "I know I'll cry because of this." There's none of that going on inside the human brain at this age. It's just danger, and it elicits a response because this is the one and only coping skill the human has at this age. It cannot run. It can do this. And more often than not, some super scared parent picks it up and does a variety of things to get it to do this. And it's not clear exactly what it was that happened that got it to do this, but both in the mind of the parent and definitely in the tiny little brain of this cute little baby, all of a sudden everything's okay because this is safety, and that little brain is now flooded with the same neurotransmitters the lizard got when it found that rock. Now, there's a difference between the two lizards I showed you. The first lizard, that's all it's got, and it is never going to change. That same lizard wakes up the next day, is on the same spot on the desert floor, the same bird comes at it, the exact same angle, at the same time, and it does not say, "Oh yeah, I remember what happened yesterday." Or it certainly doesn't say, "I'm not going to that part of the desert floor because I know it's scary." And it certainly doesn't say, "I remember where that rock was from yesterday." Those are all signs of intelligence, because the brain, in our case, learns. In the case of the lizard, it never does. So what happens in the baby's brain is that the rest of the lights start turning on. Slowly. And guess what's been in command? This part. Chief Operating Officer of the human brain. And it never is asked to leave office. The rest of it is the kind of support staff. Well, we're going to help you out a little bit, but you're still in charge. The human brain over time, and you're in the education field, so you see this, the human brain develops. It learns, it remembers, it recognizes patterns, it applies logic, it knows how to anticipate, and it thinks. That's what the human brain does. That's why our species is so intelligent, is because it can do all this better than any other species, any other brain on the planet. We've got this incredible intellect, and it's all supplementary to survival instinct. The brain gets smarter. So, the asset is that if I'm on the desert floor the next day, I do remember about that bird, and I'm looking up in the sky, so I'm not scared, or I know where that rock is in advance, because I have pattern recognition skills, and that threat is no longer dangerous to me. However, because that is my only way I use my brain, triggered primarily by the fear and survival instinct, my brain is also incredibly good at creating problems, which is the liability. So this is what happens when the human brain evolves. It goes from this very simplistic danger versus safety, and then the babies, the lights are turning on, right? It's not just danger and safety anymore. It turns into discomfort and comfort. Same response. Then you become 5, and I'm bored. And I don't really have a lot of ways to say it, so I'm going to keep doing what I've been doing, which is crying, until somebody changes the channel or buys me a new toy or gets to go outside and play a game with me, and then I'm happy because it's fun. All right, then you become a teenager. Same response. Then you're in your 20s. Then you become an adult. I mean, with the complexity of our lives these days, there's always something that isn't quite right. And if your brain developed like mine, that generates the exact same fear instinct as if I'm being chased on a desert floor. And the likelihood of my brain having a sustainable flow of positive, happy, everything's great neurotransmitters is contingent on the fact that every single little goal I have in my life is going well. I don't know about you. I don't know how to do that. I'm only focusing on the dangerous ones, which are the ones that don't seem quite right. And I tend to focus on just those, even though that 90% of my life is going just fine. I have problems. I have problems. Maybe you have problems too. I think the universal definition of a problem is any situation that presents itself to me less than I anticipated, I expected, I thought, I wanted. It is entirely conditional, meaning this brain, because of its logic and superior intellect, has created a set of expectations based on my prior experience that I expect to happen, and they don't. It's a problem. These are entirely created, manufactured things between my ears, and they are not life-threatening. But I respond to them like I'm a lizard being chased by a bird of prey. And I've been doing that for 50 years. Here's a diagrammatic representation. Those of you who are visual learners. On any given day, here's me. Here's where I think I'm supposed to be. It's not where I am, it's over there. I've got a direction I need to go, it's that way. This is my goal. I'm not there. There's this gap between where I am and where I think I should be. In this case, the gap is in deficit, meaning I'm not there yet. So how do I feel? Is this a problem? Well, it depends. It depends on whether or not I'm making progress. So my goal to become a doctor, that staircase I showed you, took me 15 years from my high school graduation. That was 15 years of what could arguably be considered negative gaps, deficits. But I was making progress for 15 straight years. And so if I'm moving toward the goal, I feel hope. And if I'm not moving toward the goal of my problem, which I created between my ears, I feel fear. So I'm a lumper, not a splitter. I tend to lump things together for simplicity. From an emotional standpoint, that relay station between what I thought and my instincts, I basically think it's either hopeful or fearful. These are the only two emotions, hope and fear. Hope being the general base for things like happiness, benevolence, goodwill, giddiness, love. Fear being the basic principle behind anger, anxiety, depression, burnout. In any given moment, I'm assessing whether I'm achieving my goal or not. And that dictates my emotion. And if you're like me, 95% of my things could be going well, but the 5 that aren't are scary. And I'm always in fear. And none of the problems are life-threatening. So my definition of a human emotion, as I just said, is the passive signal in the brain declaring the sustainability of that gap. The gap's in deficit, but if I'm making progress and I'm moving in the right direction, it feels good. Hope. If the gap is in deficit, it feels horrible, scary, fear. Here's an analogy. The gap between reality, meaning where I am, and what I set, my goal, my expectation, what is. I forgot to say that I flew in today from San Diego, having the ability to participate for a short 3 days of what's a much longer road trip that the rest of my family's on right now. We were all cooped up together in a tiny little car, driving through Southern California and 100-degree heat in the southwestern desert of Arizona because we went to see the Grand Canyon. And guess what? When one of the teenage girls in the car really needs to go to the bathroom, and this is what you're looking at out the window, that's called an unsustainable gap. Okay? I'm never going to get to urinate. How much longer to the next rest stop? Oh, I have an idea. Let's take a different freeway, because I'm smart. And I have navigation on my car, and there's another road over here we could go, and it's not all those red dots like Google's got now on their navigation. I'm intelligent, I know how to do this, and I made a choice to that freeway. Okay? The bladder is just as full. I'm still not at the bathroom. But what do I feel now? Hope. Nothing changed, except the way I see it. So progress, I would say, is incredibly seductive. What happens, though, when you've exceeded your goal? You still have a gap. This time it's in surplus. I would argue that you have the same fear-hope tightrope. Because what happens to goals? They can be lost. Who here's a football fan? Not too much, okay. So in a football game, there's only really one thing you want, right? And that's the lead. Okay? There's only 2 things that humans fear. Having something that you really, really value taken away from you, or having something that you really, really value never achieved. Okay? So my football analogy, you're really invested in the game. You really, really want the lead. Okay? Now, if you have the lead, does that mean everything's okay? No. What if the other team scores a touchdown? Okay, so this gap, it's positive, but it's still not sustainable because they're catching up. On the other hand, if you're behind, it seems like it's never going to be good. You're never going to catch up until you score a touchdown. You're still behind, but it feels hopeful. So if you can imagine watching a football game, spending the entire game, whether you have the lead or not, in a state of fear, maybe you can imagine spending your entire life in a state of fear. That's not healthy. And it's not a conscious awareness in most people. They've set up this habitual, instinctual drive to close all their gaps, and they can only focus on the ones that are in deficit and the ones that are unsustainable, scary, and if the brain is subjected to those stress neurotransmitters like epinephrine and cortisol for 45 years, it has a real impact, not just on your mental health, but on your physical health and your emotional health, and dare I throw down the word spiritual health. Regress is just as terrifying as progress is seductive. In any given day in my life, I'm in the middle of a whole bunch of gaps. I got some that are in deficit, some that are in surplus, but I'm living over here on what I call the fear-hope tightrope, and it's exhausting. And of course, I have many, many goals in my life, like you do, because you live complex lives. You have your career goals, you have your recreational goals, your family goals, your financial goals, your romantic goals, even the goals you might want to set as a legacy for you on this planet. And if you're like me, all you can do is look at the things that aren't yet achieved and feel dangerous and live in a state of fear. Where is the happiness? This is an old sonar picture. It's looking for the threats. 95% of that is black and has no threats on it, but all my brain does is scan for the things that aren't quite right. That last picture of the baby, something ain't right. So this is where I live. I don't know about you, but this is an exhausting place to be. And I've been doing it for so long, it's habitual. The fact that I'm talking about it now has required some sort of a awakening that I could never have had on my own. This is a picture of a rainstorm over the Continental Divide. The Continental Divide being that mountain range in the middle of the country, well, slightly more west. And it is said at the Continental Divide that any raindrop that falls to the eastern slope eventually ends up in the Atlantic Ocean. And any raindrop that falls to the western slope eventually ends up in the Pacific Ocean. Okay? And what does water do when it keeps following the same path over and over again? It's the same thing that thinking does to your brain. And I'm not just using this as an analogy, it's true. If you actually look at thought processes in the adult human brain, people think a certain way so habitually that it's almost impossible to break the habit just because it seems like a good idea. When water goes through mountains, it starts as little waterfalls, becomes creeks, brooks, rivers, and eventually so much habitual thought process has happened. My raindrops for 45 years have been dropping to the western slope of the Continental Divide, and I've got a Grand Canyon's worth of inertia to overcome if I want to live and use my brain in a more productive way, because this is all happening by habit right now. 100% is mindless. So the way humans do think is rooted in instinct and fear. It becomes long practiced. It is one-dimensional. It is purely conditional. It is habitual, and it is mindless. And it is incredibly hard to change. And this is when my brain is using me. What does practicing meditation have a shot at helping you do? Meditating is a way to exercise your brain in a way it would never have thought of before, to learn how to accept each moment as it is without judging it, getting out of yourself, getting out of your intellect, getting out of your instinct, and just living in the present moment as it is. Now, maybe that makes perfect sense to some of you and you're going to go out and do it today from now on. No, unfortunately, you're not, because you probably have a Grand Canyon's deep hole on one side of the brain, and the likelihood of you just by force of will getting the raindrops to fall on the other side starting tomorrow, because it seems like a good idea, is pretty low. It requires practice, and that's all meditation is a way to practice to use your brain in a different way than you instinctually learned. The way humans can think is based in truth and acceptance. It must be practiced. It is multidimensional. It is unconditional. It is purposeful. It is mindful. And as I said at the fourth point on my first slide, it is very hard, but it is very healthy. And this is where you get to the point where you are using your brain and it is not using you. So who's been to the London Underground? Okay, so those of you who actually know what this means. The London Underground, for some reason, it's a subway system, and for some reason they engineered it so that when the train comes and you're at the platform, there's this gap you need to cross. And if you're not paying attention, you might fall right between, because there's enough space for most of a human body to fall right down there and get squashed. So there's these signs all over the place that say, mind the gap. That's what it means in London. This is what it means here today. You got your gaps. And the only reason they're gaps is because you created the expectations because you're smart. It may not always be serving you well. What would happen to this paradigm if in the moment you recognized you couldn't control the gap, or maybe the expectation you set for yourself wasn't realistic, or that maybe in 10 years you'll achieve this, but it's not going to be today, and you let go of the expectation? What happens when you let go of the goal in the moment? You let go of the gap. And if you let go of the gap, the whole fear-hope tightrope is gone. Even the direction you've told yourself you need to be going is gone. And if you have been a Buddhist monk on the side of a mountain and have no idea who Steve Martin is, you probably don't have a real clear sense of who you are. There's no me. There's no identity. Non-judgmental awareness of the present moment. So there, I've explained it. This is not formal mindfulness training. This is just some concepts in case something like this seems to resonate. Meditating is a way of working out your brain. The brain is definitely capable of transforming all of these pathways. It just takes a very long time, takes a lot of practice. It's not intuitive. It won't go smoothly. You'll think that you suck at it, and there is no immediate return on investment. No wonder nobody does it. No wonder. Meditation is one of the hardest things. It's basically trying to break the most hardwired habit your brain has ever had and trying to break it. It's breaking a habit. I took this up at around 46 years old. I fully expect if I make it to whatever twice 46 is, 92, I may have a shot at maybe having enough water going on either side of the continental divide that I feel maybe I'm in balance. Okay, it's going to take, I'm giving it 46 more years. Okay, it's not going to happen overnight. So in the last few minutes, am I way over time? Okay, I'm just going to blaze through these last slides because this is for you scientific-minded people. This is a really important part when I'm talking to doctors because they think everything I've said so far is bullshit. It doesn't apply to them. So, mindfulness is also a scientific study. It takes into account brain anatomy, neurophysiology, psychology, sociology, and most important for today, the concept of wellness and the benefit of meditating that has on your wellness. It's all over the news. It's in Scientific American, it's in National Geographic, and even for you counterculture people who like the Portland Mercury, Even people with tattoos are meditating. This is a picture of John Kabat-Zinn, who's been studying this for over 30 years. This is a picture of Richard Davidson, who actually maps the brain during meditation and can actually see clear evidence of how it changes the brain. Not just in the moment of what it looks like when it's meditating, but over time, the changes in the anatomy, the blood flow, the physiology, and the neural connections of the human brain with meditating. He talks about neuroplasticity, which means even though you're an adult, you can change your brain. He talks about epigenetics, that even though your DNA is not going to change, meditation will help your brain. He talks about the fact that meditating has bidirectional pathways. So most people believe that exercising physically has good health benefits for the brain. He's showing that exercising mentally has incredibly good benefits for the body. And being good, being that person you always wanted to be when you took up the career in in education, that is a skill, my friends. That is a skill. It is not an entitlement, just because you decided to go in the field of education. I'm going to show you some slides that basically show that it's been scientifically studied. This article was from 1985, so over 30 years ago, the use of mindfulness in chronic pain management. Here's a study on the use of mindfulness to actually alter my ability to feel altruistic. Altruism is a skill. Here's one on treating depression that's been resistant to antidepressant medicine. Here's one that's preventing relapse and addiction disorder. Here's one that's used where mindfulness is used to treat hypertension. Here's one where it's being used to treat diabetes. Here is a graph showing the number of research articles on the subject of mindfulness. Here's 1980, here's 1990, here's 2000, here's 2010. Here is the front part of your anterior cingulate gyrus that you're using right now, because this is a novel experience. Here is that other part of your brain that's right next door that doesn't talk to your anterior cingulate gyrus. This is where you are all day long in your everyday rote memory exercises where you're doing nothing but on the fear-hope tightrope trying to manage your gaps. Okay? This is where we live all day long. This is where Buddha is. When you take MRIs, this is a representation of a functional MRI where they can actually map the blood flow of the brain in the present moment. Meditating people have this light up. Non-meditating people have this light up. Orthopedic surgeons do not have one of these. Buddhist monks do not have one of these. I mean, there is actual size differences. You take a 50 longshoremen and put them into a dark room for 20 minutes every day for 6 weeks. And you do an MRI of their brain before the 6 weeks and after, and you will see measurably, statistically relevant increases in blood flow to their anterior cingulate gyrus. So it's all over my literature to medicate or to meditate, and this talks about using mindfulness to be a doctor, not for my personal wellness. And it's all over the education literature as well on how mindfulness might pass down eventually on how to teach kids and be mindful in class. My primary point in a wellness discussion is to take care of you first and bring that oxygen mask on your face before you start using it on anybody else's. Because if you think this is a good idea for somebody else, and I bet you all have somebody in mind who you're going to go home and say, you know what? I heard this really compelling talk today. You should meditate. So here I was. I didn't know that it's possible to jettison the rocket fuel. I didn't know. So when I got out into outer space, I was still blasting away. I no longer had the gravitational pull of the Earth that I had to overcome. My little stepladder had finished. I got to the top, and this amount of force is not only unnecessary at that point, it's actually dangerous. It was absolutely necessary to get to where I wanted to be, to become a doctor, and I don't regret it for 1 minute, but I can see now why aeronautical and space engineers recommend jettisoning the rocket fuel when you get into outer space. It's dangerous. Okay, this is what that little capsule eventually looks like once the rocket's gone, and here it is attached to the International Space Station. There's nothing down here anymore, it's gone. There are a lot of resources. I can blast through these slides quickly. All you have to do is type the word mindfulness into the internet, but there's a magazine called Mindful. They have their own website called mindful.org. This is an author. This is a Vietnamese monk whose name is almost unpronounceable, but it's Thich Nhat Hanh. He is the Vietnamese monk that gave John Kabat-Zinn his spiritual center before he decided to go research it. Full Catastrophe Living is a book that John Kabat-Zinn wrote many years ago. It's kind of his entry-level book on the subject if you're interested. If you have depression in your life or somebody you know, there's a book called Mindful Way Through Depression. This one actually comes with a CD with guided meditations in the back on doing guided mindfulness meditation. This is another good book on how to train a wild elephant and other adventures in mindfulness. That other guy, Richard Davidson, this is an incredible undertaking. Do not pick this one up as your first book. In fact, I wouldn't even pick this up. I would just get it on audiobooks and give yourself a lot of time to listen to it. But it's fascinating. The American Mindfulness Research Association has a website talking about all their publications. This is an app that I love and use every day. It's called Headspace. It's on my phone. I get to work 20 minutes before I need to be there. I put my car in park. I put my seat in a different position that makes me feel upright. I put my phone on Bluetooth. I close my eyes and I meditate for 20 minutes in a guided fashion on this app. I've been doing that for about a year and a half now. Guess what? I can't write down for you what the return on investment is. I'm taking it on blind faith, but I'm here to tell you it's really healthy. And there's no way to get out of that trap of that habitual thought pattern without meditating or doing something along these lines. There is such a thing called formal mindfulness training. I said it at the outset. This is an 8-week stress reduction course. If you're really hardcore and you want a deep dive right off the outset, this is mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR. It's available all over Portland. And my last quote. Some stories don't have a clear beginning and end. Life is about not knowing, having to change, taking the moment and making the best of it without knowing what is going to happen next. Delicious ambiguity. Who here finds ambiguity delicious? Who would find ambiguity delicious? I'll tell you who. Dying people. This is all based. Mindfulness is just our generation's term for this, okay? The Buddhists figured this out centuries ago. It's just the same thing. The reason it's such a popular topic now is because there's all the science behind it to prove that the Buddhist monks were actually right all along. Buddhism has a principle: learning how to die before you die. This sort of acceptance in life at some point before your deathbed. Acceptance. That's all that spiritual Buddhism is learning how to accept the present moment. And all of us are hardwired to find that incredibly difficult and counterintuitive, unless you meditate. Thank you.